So I've got some slides here, but I'm happy to try and kind of make this relevant for what people in the room want. So I've got a few fundamental things that I think it's useful to understand about our brain in business, and then we can go off at a few tangents if people ask me questions that send us down those tangents. But let me start by saying a little bit about me and my company, because people are usually curious about that. So my company's name is Head, Heart and Brain, and it really got named that because it describes what we do. So we work with organisations, and we work with the head, so the logical, rational part of what goes on in organisations, the business bit if you like. We work with the heart, which is getting buy-in and the emotional side of an organisation, which is often very under-thought about and under-utilised. And we work with the brain, which is an understanding of neuroscience and how that, what the neuroscientists are finding in their labs, how that applies to organisations, and particularly how it applies to leadership, both in terms of how leaders present themselves and lead themselves, but also how they lead the people who work with them. I am not a neuroscientist, and I've had quite a bad reaction about that from other audiences. Do I have any neuroscientists in the room? Okay, I always ask that because I once did have one, and I really could have utilised his skills at the time. So what I did in order to be able to talk to you about this, and in order to be able to do the things my organisation does, is I did a postgraduate certificate and then a master's in neuroleadership. So what that is looking at what the neuroscientists are discovering in their labs and saying, how does this apply to organisations? And does it translate to organisations? And if so, what's it telling us that might be useful? Now, some of that contradicts or challenges some pretty firmly held beliefs we have about the way organisations work and the way people operate in them. If one of the points I make hits one of your beliefs and challenges it, I would ask you just to sit with the discomfort that it will create, because it will create discomfort, and I'll explain why it's doing that later in the talk. But sitting with that discomfort for a while is one of the kind of routes to innovation, to having new ideas. Okay, so that's a little bit about me. Let's talk about the brain. So you don't really need to understand lots and lots about the brain to understand why it's important in organisations. Obviously, we've all got one, and we all use it in the course of our work. But let's just talk about some brain basics. And I'm going to use my arm in order to illustrate that. So if you think about this part of my arm, that kind of represents the spinal cord. And at the top of that, we've got the brain stem. And the brain stem is basically responsible for all the bits of our functioning that we don't really have any conscious awareness of, or most of the time we don't. So it runs our immune system, it runs our heartbeat, it runs much of our breathing, which obviously we can bring that to consciousness, but most of the time we don't. It's responsible for a lot of our ability to move and so on. You know, if something goes wrong there, you're in serious trouble. If I wrap my finger around like this, you get this piece here that's often called the limbic brain or the emotional brain. So this is where a lot of how we socialise with people and what motivates us to socialise with people and how we act comes from. And that limbic brain area is the second oldest part of the brain. It's very energy efficient. And what that means is the brain has evolved to push most of what we do into the habit center, which sits in that limbic brain. So something like 70 to possibly 90% of what we do is habit, and that includes most of what we do in our job. And if you want change to happen, that's a really important thing to remember, and we'll pick that up again towards the end of the talk. Sitting in this part of the brain is also the emotional center, the amygdala. So it's it's a really important area for us in terms of our functioning at work. If I wrap my fingers around, that kind of represents the cortical brain, so the bit that's usually displayed as grey and wiggly. And in business, we often think of the cortical brain as the most important bit. It's often called the executive functions of the brain. Actually, it gets tired incredibly quickly. In an hours-long talk like this, your cortical brain will switch off many times because you won't be able to maintain the same levels of concentration. And when we push it too hard, it quickly starts to function in a way that's kind of not optimal. And it's very, very dependent on its signals from this limbic brain to really function effectively. If I put my two hands together, you've got the kind of right and left hemispheres. And one of the brain myths, that, as we're on a conference about innovation, that's worth knowing is that whilst those two hemispheres have slightly different functions, if one is damaged, the other one will pick it up. And looking at the research, there's no evidence that people are more right-brained or more left-brained. We are all capable of activating both those sides of the brain. We're equally capable of being both analytical and innovative. So that whole kind of brain myth about are you a right brain person or a left brain person has no kind of basis in research. A couple of other things to think about. So one thing to keep remembering about the brain is it pushes stuff into this habit area. The other is that this cortical brain gets tired very quickly. So just hold those kind of two pieces in your mind as we talk. Any questions from people? Let's make this kind of interactive. Talk to me if you want to know something about that piece. No? Okay, so I want to talk about a couple of fundamental things we understand about the brain that we sometimes don't pay enough attention to in business. And then I'll introduce you to a model that you can use those things with. And then we're going to talk about how you motivate people to kind of do the things you want to do in your business and to innovate. So let's talk about social connection and its role in business. But first of all, let's do a little experiment. So can you sort of basically get into pairs? So just turn to the person you're sitting next to or turn to the person behind you. Okay, so I would like one of you to be person A. Can we just make sure one of you know who person A is? Yeah. So person A, your role is to sit completely impassively. I don't want to see any expression on your face. I don't want you to say anything. I don't want you to do anything. I want you to just sit there. Okay? Is that all right? Pleased you picked person A. Person B, you've got the work to do. So person B, what I want you to do is either to pay person A a genuine compliment. If you've never met them before and you can't notice anything about them that you want to compliment, tell them a joke. smile at them if you're really struggling, or talk about something that you feel, is interesting to them. So basically what you're doing is being a nice person, a really, really nice person. Off you go. That's the right way round to do it. If you've got two Okay, sorry, something's gone wrong. What happened? All the people you're laughing, you're smiling, you're giggling. What happened? You didn't follow the instructions.
They liked the fact that you were nice to them and they wanted to respond back.
Exactly. So what did people feel when they were person A? What happened?
It's nice to be complimented.
Yeah. And when someone compliments you,
you smile.
You smile, exactly. You have a reaction. And that's what we mean by social connection. So our brain is evolved to connect socially with other people. And a lot of the research that's been done around this basically is telling us that Maslow got his hierarchy wrong. So if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it says we have these basic needs. We have need for shelter, for food, to recreate ourselves. But what neuroscience is now telling us is that we also have the need for social connection, that is a fundamental need, and without it, we cannot survive. And if you think about the human species, it can't survive without a child being able to persuade its carers to put the child's needs above the adult's needs or the carer's needs. As humans, there's very little we can achieve on our own. We need to be able to connect with other people to make things happen. So, out on the savannah, we needed to be able to persuade others to come and hunt with us or to gather with us. We needed the help of other people to look after the children while that hunting and gathering was going on. And it's no different in business. One of the kind of fundamental issues I think we have in business is we hold a mental assumption that people come to work as an economic proposition. So they give you, as a business owner or manager, their time and their skills, and you give them some sort of monetary reward. What we tend to underplay is the importance of the social rewards in business. So there's the importance of how people work as a team, how they connect with each other, how they spend that time at the coffee machine, how ideas are generated by people having what are apparently useless conversations with each other. So some of the work that's been done on this by a neuroscientist called Matt Lieberman believes that, this part of our brain, this prefrontal cortex part, the piece that we kind of think is so important for rational logical thinking, actually grew larger in the human animal, not to do rational logical thinking, but to be able to connect with other people. And we have a specialized area of the brain, of that prefrontal cortex, running down the midline here, called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is a specialized area that has evolved to think about ourselves and to think about others. And when that area of our brain tends to activate as a default, it's often called the default area or the default system, because it activates whenever we're not involved in an analytical or a task orientation. So Lieberman says within a couple of seconds, 3 to 4 seconds, that we're not focused on a task or thinking about a task, that default area will come on. And if you think about it, you know, if you were walking here from the station or you were in the shower this morning, what are you thinking about? You're probably thinking about, how am I going to get to that conference? What sort of people are going to be there? You know, will there be interesting people? Who do I want to connect with? Who's, you know, going to also be there? You're thinking about yourself, or you're thinking about others. And some of Lieberman's research would begin to suggest that the better we are at understanding ourselves, because there's an 85% overlap in the brain areas where we also understand about people, so the better we are at understanding ourselves, the better we're going to be at understanding other people. And to some extent we are, you know, we have the brain capacity to do that, in that we will make assumptions about people. We will read what we think the motivation and what's important to other people is. And that's all going on in this area, this default area, this medial prefrontal cortex area of the brain. So what does this mean in business? Well, it means that our connections to others are even more important than we think they are. People who are, you know, activating, let me say something else, because of this seesaw effect, that if I'm, you know, thinking about analytical, strategy, tasky type things, my default center is basically off, it's not activated. And the minute I stop thinking about those tasky things, the reverse happens. It can be that we get in the habit of not noticing the signals from that area of the brain. So we stop noticing the kind of unconscious signals that people are sending us when their voice, when they're saying yes to us, but there's no commitment in their voice. When they're sitting looking uncomfortable in a meeting, when they want to speak in a meeting but they're a bit shy, and so they're kind of trying to lean in, but someone else who's very vocal is taking up the airspace. So our habits of thinking and noticing can mean that we don't tune into those signals in that area of that it's sending to us. The other thing to understand is that when we are challenged socially, when we're given negative feedback, particularly in public, if someone ignores us, so we're not brought into the group, when our kind of opinions and what we have to say is rejected, we actually experience that as pain in the brain. So Lieberman did some really interesting research with his wife, Naomi Essenberger, where they put people in a scanner and they thought they were playing a game with 2 other people. So a ball was passed between these 3 people, and after a minute or so, the 2 people stopped throwing the ball to the person who was in the scanner. So they were seeing this on a screen, obviously. And what they saw was the pain areas of the brain activated. So exactly the same areas of the brain, whereas if you've got stomach cramp or you squeeze your finger in the car door, are activated. And what Lieberman says is, you know, pain is a signal to us that we need to take care. It was a signal to us that we needed to watch out for our survival. And social pain is that same signal. So again, in business, you know, a question to ask yourself is, how much is my environment being respectful of the social inclusion and avoiding creating social pain for people. So if you think about your performance management system, you think about how your senior managers treat people, you think about how much, people of minorities and so on are listened to and are included. All of those things are activating that pain receptors in the brain. I think there was a question.
I guess that infers also depression, I think depression comes from that, doesn't it? Because you can feel depressed if you're not valued, or I think that can, presumably pain is also, depression is part of pain, I guess, isn't it?
So I think there's potentially an element. I think there are lots of other factors in depression, like chemical imbalances. I'm not a doctor, I'm not an expert on that, so
I've experienced that myself in the past, where you just felt undervalued and your performance drops as well. And it's not these days, but in the past.
One thing we know, when people are excluded, they often go into kind of survival mode. And when they're feeling, we'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, but when they're feeling like that, one of the things we do is stop reaching out to other people. So it becomes a kind of vicious circle.
Do you know if there's any work being done on cultural influences with this? Because there are some, I've worked with some very cross-cultural teams, and some people seem to be enormously more sensitive to these social connections than others.
So the only research I know is about the difference between individual and collective cultures. So if you think about, Chinese and Japanese people moving to the States is where most of that research has been done, both in those countries and the States. You see, because the brain is actually quite malleable, quite plastic, it's called, so neuroplasticity, the more we do one thing purposefully, the more our brain will, literally the cells will start to kind of connect in a different pattern. I don't know of any research that says have people got greater or lesser needs for social connection. I think what we will see is stereotypical ways of behaving that are different, not necessarily that the need is different. Okay, so that's social connection, really kind of important thing for us. The other thing that's pretty fundamental in my view is the way the brain responds to threat. So let's do another little experiment here. What I mean by threat, I'm going to actually get you to experience it for a very short period of time. So what I want you to do is notice what's going on in your body when you do what I'm going to ask you to do, and particularly kind of this bit here. So think about the worst person you ever worked with. And remember what that was like at its worst. Okay. How did that make you feel? Angry.
And fairly placid, because I'm grateful it's in the past. And
you weren't fully engaged in it.
But it just goes to prove that time is the great healer.
Yes.
Things that at the time are traumatic, now you don't even think about it because you've packed them.
Yeah. What else? What else did? Okay, so you notice your body got quite tense. Yeah.
Quite stressed.
Yeah.
Well, it's a raise of cortisol level, so the heart rate goes up, and
Yeah.
you get
So
more
your
shallow
heart goes-
breathing.
yeah. That's a threat response. So things that we call stress, extreme stress, things that that sort of physicality that you experience, that's a mild threat response. And what we know is the brain notices something like 3 to 5 times more threat than it does a sense of reward. So that sense of social connection that you experienced. And the trouble with that in business is because social connection is so important, most of the threats are to do with other people. So if your boss walks in and is frowning, you get that you get that threat response. If you're in a team that's dysfunctional, you get that threat response. If you, if you're given negative feedback, you get that threat response. Even if someone says to you, I want to give you some feedback, you get that threat response. So it's very dominant in business, and the trouble with it is when we feel very strong threat, or we continually feel it, those rational, logical, executive parts of the brain don't work so well. Because our brain is saying, oh my God, I've got to kind of survive, and I don't need to kind of understand quantum physics to survive, I just need to know how I protect myself. So we're less able to make decisions, we're less able to do kind of analytical processing, we're less able to problem solve, and we tend to be less creative. Creativity isn't all in this part of the brain, but because that part of the brain's kind of fuzzing around, focusing on other things, we're not thinking about kind of how we solve issues. So, if you're in a threatening culture in your firm, you've got people who are spending more time and energy thinking about how they protect themselves rather than thinking about how they solve the problems you've got in your organisations. This permeates both your kind of business processes as well as how you as a leader might behave, and how teams then interact with each other. The other overlay to these things is that, and I think relevant to what we were hearing before the break, is that we instantly and automatically, completely out of consciousness, will decide whether someone is like us and therefore it's okay to engage with them, or they're not like us, in which case we better get out of there because the threat response is activating. It's typically called in-group, out-group. Within a nanosecond, we have made a judgment mainly by physical appearance, so gender, skin colour, facial differences, voice differences, accents, for example. We've made a decision and we've categorised people into like me, not like me. And that's the basis of all stereotypes, it's the basis of all prejudice. That's why we've got the gender pay gap, it's why we haven't got women in senior positions. Because once we've made that decision, it's very hard to shift it. And in order to shift it, we have to slow down our processing. And everything in business is trying to persuade us to do things fast, make fast decisions, do your work fast, don't stand around socialising, all those sorts of things. So I thought it was really interesting what the lady from AIM had to say about how they're slowing down what they're doing. That works with the brain. Some really interesting research that's just been done by a guy called Van Bevel at New York University, that showed when you get people to slow down their thinking, they stop being prejudiced against outgroups, against people who aren't like them. So, questions about those things, comments?
Has there been studies about how sort of efficient the rational brain is with, say, some of the disruptors, people like Peter, people like FTSE 250 chief execs, that they're more able to access that rational brain more often?
I don't know of any studies that have done that. It's a very interesting question. What we know at the moment is, obviously everyone's got slight differences, but your ability to stay focused on something is a function of what you eat. It's a function of how much sleep you have. And it's a function of being able, kind of, you can train your brain to do that. So that's effectively what mindfulness meditation is doing. It's training your brain to focus on kind of one thing. What we do know is people who activate this medial prefrontal cortex much more, so people who mind wander are much better at solving problems. So if you're in a good mood and you mind wander a lot, and Peter was saying he needs time to sort of hang out and not really do anything, and that's where all his good ideas come from. That's a good use of your brain. So the more you allow your brain that kind of not working, as we often call it, the more you're likely to solve problems through insight, those aha moment problems. And if you add to that being in a good mood and being relaxed, then the kind of number goes up even more. And what they can actually see if they put you in a brain scanner is whether you're going to solve those problems by logic or whether you're going to solve them by that aha moment type of thing. So they can actually see the kind of connections happening in the brain. So, you know, if you want more innovation and you want your people to solve more problems, slow down, get them in a good mood. Don't feed them lots of sugary stuff, feed them vegetables. Yeah.
Is there any research on the difference between emotional threat and actual physical danger?
It activates in your brain in exactly the same way. So,
Intensity?
not necessarily, no. So if, so let's look at the reward side of it. If someone gives me a compliment, praises me, for example, that activates the same areas of the brain as someone giving me a monetary reward. And if someone kind of criticizes me in public, that's activating the same areas of the brain as if I see someone standing in reception with a knife. Now, there will be a filter in there where I'll be thinking, am I more in danger of the man with the knife than I am, or person with the knife, than I am with being publicly criticised? But in terms of what's happening in my brain, it's no different.
Interesting about different organisations, their structures as well, because, I mean, for example, I'm sure it sounds like ARM's a very flat structure. I mean, I work for a company that's got a very flat structure. If you get a very hierarchical structure, lots of tiers of management, maybe too many, that's going to create this whole protect yourself and be afraid to speak out. And so I think the flatter the structure, the more creative it's going to be, isn't it?
Potentially. What a hierarchy will do is build in lots of different in-groups. And it will feel quite hard to move from one in-group to the next. I mean, that's what the structure is, effectively. But you can have lots of in and out groups, even in a flat structure. So it's about whether people have a common purpose and common goals. Let me talk to you I'm running a bit late here. This is a model that we put together looking at lots and lots of different bits of neuroscience research that kind of says to us what are the things that create a sense of threat or a sense of reward. And so there's been lots of research done that these, in a social setting, these four things are what most often create a sense of threat or a sense of reward. So if you're a manager or you're looking at kind of how you make change happen, particularly, I think this can be very useful. And remember, most of this is happening at an unconscious level, and what you see is the behaviour that it generates. So the brain is a kind of recognition machine. It looks for patterns, and if those patterns are met, it feels certain. If they're not met, it feels a sense of threat. So the more certainty you can help people have, the more functioning their brain's going to be. And if you think about it in change, that's quite a hard thing to do. So helping people, even small things can make quite a difference there. Even giving people control over the agenda of the meeting or telling them when the next meeting's going to be can help. We like options. It's better to have 2 bad choices than no choices at all. So if you want someone to do something, don't tell them what they have to do. Think you can do this or you can do this, and you're much more likely to get a yes from it. Reputation, I think, is the absolute kind of key. We've talked about, feedback in public. We've talked about criticism in public. So we all hold a kind of social hierarchy where we know where we sit in relation to other people in our group. So whether that group is your family, the mates you play darts with down the pub, or it's your work group. And if our place in the social hierarchy is depressed, so we're pushed down, we feel a sense of threat. If it's elevated, we feel a sense of reward. So, and it appears that when we learn something new, that sense of our reputation increases. So here's the me who didn't know something, and here's the me who's been on my course and I know something. I feel a greater sense of reward for having done that. So in change, again, this is a key thing to think about. How is our change disrupting people's place in their in-group? You don't have to worry about everything, but think about their in-group. That's why you get different reactions to change in different bits of the organisation. And if you want people to kind of connect together, think about how you're using that idea of the kind of people's place in the social hierarchy. So how are your teams kind of helping each other feel safe, feel rewarded, rather than, you've got kind of the goodies and the not so goodies, or the high performers and the not so high performers. And then we seem to have an innate sense of equity, of fairness. And we know that they kind of stick people in a scanner and make them play games with money. And, people will reject an offer of money if they think it's unfair, even though that means they're actually worse off. So we use this model kind of in change. We use it to kind of plan meetings. We use it to think about, if we're trying to persuade someone to do something, how might the kind of thing we're trying to persuade them to do impact their certainty, options, reputation, or equity. Any questions about that?
How do you get people to accept a different in-group? You've got one group, you need to bring in new people.
The easiest way is to get them to identify what's similar rather than what's different. And the easiest way to do that is to have some common goals. In-groups and out-groups are very sort of important, but they're also quite easily manipulated. And we, if you think, we change our in-group and out-group all the time. So, if I'm driving, my in-group is other drivers. That's what I've got in common. Those are people who are similar to me. If I'm a pedestrian, even though I'm also a driver, suddenly my out-group are drivers. So we manipulate those things all the time. But what tends to happen in organisations, and we do quite a lot of work around, our next book out is on gender, so we do a lot of work about this, is we kind of hold a belief that you can't challenge some of those things. And that's the root of stereotypes. So, because we've created an in-group or an out-group around men and women, basically. But as soon as you start to get people talking as people, as opposed to as their job role, those things start to dissipate really, really quickly. But
I'm thinking of one particular instance where it's definitely not happening.
Okay. The other thing to think about this is from whose point of view are you looking at this? So if you're a senior leader, what gives you a sense of certainty may be the exact thing that gives your employees a sense of uncertainty. So, you know, I often use performance management as an example because it's kind of so topical at the moment. But, you know, if you're a senior leader, you know, you've got the kind of certainty of what grade you're going to give people or what the feedback is. You know when you're going to set the meeting, you know, etc. You've got options around that. Your sense of reputation is enhanced by you're the person who's giving the feedback. And you probably think the system's fair. If you're the employee, it's the complete reverse. In most organisations, not in all organisations. So in change, for example, often one of the things that's really difficult for leaders is they want to get people to do something else, but they're looking at it from their perspective. This is easy, why wouldn't you want to do it? They're not looking at it from the impact that it's having on the certainty, options, reputation, equity of the people you're asking them to do that. So this stuff, I mean, we've talked really about the application of this, but think about this in terms of engagement, in terms of performance management, in terms of your culture. You know, do you have a culture of threat or do you have a culture of connection? And even if you've got a pretty good culture, where might the threats be that are tripping you up? So let's talk a little bit about motivation. So most motivation we know is linked with the dopamine system. Dopamine is a neurochemical that kind of is, we have a kind of baseline of it in our brain, but we get a kind of an injection of it when what's called the reward chemical. It would be better to really be called the seeking chemical, I think, because what it propels us to do is when we anticipate something happening, that's what drives us to be motivated to do something. And when we achieve the thing, we get a shot of dopamine which persuades us to go and do it again and again and again. So in order to get people motivated, you want to get their dopamine levels increased. And the way you can do that most effectively is to break down the task so there are lots of little things they do where they have a sense of achievement and you celebrate that sense of achievement. When you do that, you keep people kind of motivated. What's really difficult for us from a motivational point of view is, you know, we're not going to see any kind of progress for months and months or even hours and hours. So we're, you know, relying on this logical part of the brain, kind of our intentional goals, rather than the more easier, I'm going to do that because it's making me feel good. Yeah? And when we put that understanding together, so basically what that's saying is if people have a clear purpose, they know where they're going to feel much more rewarded. If that clear purpose is shared, you're going to get social connection as well. And so getting those two things together creates energy in the organisation. And when we've got energy, we achieve more. So we know organisations that are energetic are more productive, they achieve more, and they do it usually in a kind of healthier type of environment. And because of what I said before about being in a good mood, they also more likely to solve problems and to innovate because they feel safer. When we're under threat, we literally narrow down our perspective. We see less. We are more risk averse. and we're less likely to kind of take decisions that might be kind of outside the norms of the in-group. So purpose, goals and energy are really what you want, and what you want both for a good culture but also for, you know, freeing people up to achieve things. So one of the things you want to do is seek the energizers in your organisation. So what do we think an energizer might be like? Think about the ones you've worked with.
Positive.
Positive, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they look for what can go right rather than what might go wrong.
Sociable.
Yeah, they've got good social connection. They're good team people.
They can infect you with a vision of
Yeah.
how something should be different from what it is now.
Yeah, so they've got a sense of purpose, whether that's about the purpose of the meeting or the purpose of the whole organisation, and they tend to articulate that. And they also tend to be have strong integrity around that, so their words and their behaviour are aligned.
Focusing on the future rather than look at mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So one of the most de-energising things is to be with someone who's always very critical or always kind of saying, we've tried that before, it didn't work.
And not criticising failure either. I think failure, you learn from failure.
Yeah.
It's so important.
So they have a growth mindset probably.
But also having the combination of being an energizer and a delegator, because some of the most successful energizers like this are the best at delegating, encouraging others to follow them up.
Yeah.
Etc.
So in the research that was done, it's not neuroscience research, it was actually networking research. What they found was that energizers, they were good performers themselves, and they kind of attracted other good performers to them, but they didn't have to have all the answers. So they would kind of almost suppress their own expertise in order to ask the group for their contribution and to get people involved in solving the problem together. I've got 5 minutes. Any questions about that?
You showed the sign of the carrot and stick. So where do you stand on damping in his study about extrinsic motivation? If I get a reward, a cash reward for that thing that motivates me, is my dopamine hit lower?
So what the research shows us is that we get used to things, so it becomes habitual. So if I constantly get lots of little rewards, my dopamine is lower because I'm expecting it. Dopamine's kind of, we don't fully understand how dopamine works, let me say that to start with. But what we do understand is we get a shot of dopamine when we achieve something we were aiming for, so like a goal. We get a shot of dopamine when what we expected to happen happens, but not as high. And if what we expected to happen doesn't happen, we get a dip. So that's why kind of bonuses and things are such an issue, unless you're actually, I mean, I worked in investment banking, so, you know, I know all about that. So, you know, actually people do roughly know what they're going to get. But if we get a surprise reward, something we weren't expecting, that's a bigger motivator. So I agree with what he did was unpick all the kind of research and present it to us in a nice, easy way to consume. But yeah.
A difference how long the feel-good feeling lasts between like an emotional reward as opposed to a material reward.
So we know, I mean, because we're creatures of habit, we will quickly expect something. So whether it's emotional or physical, the effect wears off quite quickly. Now there'll be some individual differences around that, and that's probably around where it sits in their reputation. You know, so if they, I don't know, get promoted and get a bonus, that might last them a bit longer than just getting the bonus type of thing. But if you give them a bonus and you demotivate them, you're definitely going the wrong way round about it. You'd actually do better to promote them and not give them the bonus. Any other questions? So what I wanted to talk about just on this last thing was that we've kind of alluded to it, that most behaviour is habit. And if you want people to do different things, and I think particularly if you want them to do, like, work in different ways so they're more innovative, you need to remember that in order to do that, people need to change their habits. And I think that's an element of innovation that we often forget. And I think people who do different things see different possibilities, and that's because they've broken their habitual ways of either thinking or looking at the world, or doing so. Even walking to work in a different way can help you kind of just see the world differently. And so this is the habit model. It's often attributed to Charles Duhigg, but actually it was a neuroscientist called Kevin Oshner that presented it. And what that says is, for us to adopt new ways of working, new behavioural habits, we need to know what the cue is that tells us what we should be doing. And if we can use that same cue but add to it a different routine and make sure that we get a reward for it, we are much more likely to adopt different behaviours than if we just do it through good intentions. The trouble with good intentions is that as soon as we're tired, stressed or terribly busy, we forget and we go back to the habitual behaviour. So we often work with leaders on saying, if you want to do something different, what's the cue you're going to use that's going to tell you to do that? So take a leader who wants to connect more socially with their team, but their habit is to come in, take the coat off, sit down and start doing their emails. They're going to keep doing that if they don't get a reward. If they don't get that sense of reward that says this is worth changing. So a leader that you can say, okay, so your cue's the same, you come into the office, but your new routine is going to be to walk around and talk to your team. They might keep that up, but if they don't know what the reward is, they won't. So if they understand that the reward is actually that sense of control, and that doing their emails gives them a sense of knowing what's going on and a sense of control, if they can talk to their people about what's going on, they can replace that new routine with the same reward. Does that make sense? So, this is worth thinking about, both at an organisational level. What are the cues and rewards that go on in organisations when we want a change to happen? But what are the cues and rewards we're giving people for innovating, for coming up with new ideas? And is it safe in their in-group to do that? So there's some interesting research that says the most inclusive in-groups are ones that part of the similarity, part of what kind of enables you to have access to that in-group is that you come up with different ideas. As opposed to, I conform with what everyone else is doing. We also know from Van Bevel's research again that people who feel safe in their in-group are more likely to then feel they can dissent.
Can I just share one thing, organisation I've come across which is amazing. It's in London called Entrepreneur First. Some people may know it. They basically, it's like put a lot of people together, invest in the people, not the technologies. Some have got technologies, some have got leadership. These guys morph together. I think one of them was Magic Pony, sold to Twitter for 150 million recently. Amazing group of people. They're just so vibrant. They just believe in people, and people get motivated and morph together to form their own companies. Best thing I've ever seen. Absolutely amazing. It's just they've got a Singapore office and a London office. That's the way to innovate. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, Idea Space in Cambridge is a similar thing.
Yeah.
Just to share that.
So that's all I have to say, except I want to give a plug to my book. So I promised I would give everyone who came to this one of these books, but unfortunately my storage people weren't able to deliver them, which is really annoying because they're only down the road. But if you would like a copy of this book, and what this book does is it takes 8 principles, we've talked about 3 of them today, and says how do you apply that in your business, and it's got case studies and little tools and tips and things that you can use. If you would like a copy, if you give me your postal address and your email, I will send you a copy. If you don't want to give up your postal address, you can buy it on Amazon. Our next book is coming out in October, and it's about 2 things. It's about how an understanding of how your brain works can help you manage your career, is one end of the book, and the other end is about gender in the workplace, particularly focusing on what the science is telling us about stereotypes. So if you would like a copy of that, please write the new book, and I'll send that to you when it's published in October. Thank you for your attention.